So we're skipping ahead a little bit. We're not skipping ahead. We finished project one. Now we're going to start to get into the notion of connecting our thing to a data source. So we need to make a backend. Now, traditionally, you go and build a whole server. I'm not getting into all that. So what we're going to do instead is work on a concept known as micro front-end architecture. This is relatively new. There's very few books published about this even. But as far as an architectural parallel, it is very similar to web components, but for back-end technology. Typically using things like AWS Lambda, things that spin up, run code very quickly, return response, spin down. So what I'm going to try and make today is a XML parser. So we're going to take XML and return it as JSON. Now this is a seemingly easy thing, but it's actually kind of complicated, unfortunately, because JSON is natively handled by the browser. XML, sort of. So what we're going to try to do is have a component that is able to spin up a service, take a file or something that is, an XML data set or pointing to an address, return it as JSON so we could do something with that, but not have that code load on the user's browser. So I'm going to use this project as a backdrop for this notion of microservices. We're not going to build this specific one. So clone this. I should look it up. All right. So I'm going to do install as usual. And I'm going to go skip ahead to Vercel while that's running. I'm going to add this as a project. Okay. Yep. We're going to modify these commands so they match because this is an OpenWC based repo. Yes, it is. Okay. I'm not sure what's under dist. All right. So we want to ignore that. Ignore. Let's make sure we don't send dist up there. Ignore no modules. Make sure dist is in there as well. All right, just glancing around. Got this security log thing, and we've got this employee XML random file thing as well that we got to parse. So the way you would traditionally have done this, let me actually just set up our output directory to be dist, and we will deploy that. So the way that you would have done this previously would be something like this. So I've got a button. You click the button, it goes to parse an XML string. And another possible way of doing this would be getting a file and then parsing an XML HTTP request. So we're not going to do that, either one of these. But these are two-way. This is actually kind of similar to how I would have tried to approach this problem, honestly, probably 3 years ago, let alone like when I actually had to do XML parsing on the JavaScript side, or PHP at the time was more typical. So I'm going to get rid of this one. We're not going to do the XML string based. Well, actually, yeah, we'll do both. But what I'm going to do is leverage a capability in Vercel that lets me make a folder called API. And in that folder called API, I'm going to make a file called XML to JSON.js. Now, if we look at the security log parser and we go visit this, it probably doesn't do anything. It might actually fail. Let's see. It says letter Q, and then this one, yeah, it's not going to have access to that file, but that's fine. So what we're going to do is I'm going to steal code from another thing that I've made previously so that I at least have the boilerplate. But there's this amazing capability built into Vercel where if you have an API folder and you have a file that ends in .js and it returns things in this format. So if you have export default function, exporting a default function, and we call it handler, and it's assumed to have a request and a response value. This is in a server, and it's like web response, if you will, very lightweight server format for a program called Express. Now, a lot of what, if you go to hacks.php.edu and you see our system and it spins up code, that's Apache delivering that. There's PHP on the back end. That server is always running. Express is kind of the Node.js parallel to that archaic server tech that still does actually power quite a bit of the internet. This is the new kids on the block, relatively speaking. But so Express is going to just be, I have the request and I've got the response. Now, there is a little bit of magic going on with Vercel to make this thing valid. But it's minimal magic. This is pretty darn close to vanilla as far as what you would write to actually interface with an Express server. So I did some prior research and I found this library. I haven't tested it yet, but it's used by a bajillion people. And it shows some very basic, hey, you get XML in, and then I can give it back to you as JSON. And so we'll find usage. There we go. So I'm going to copy this. We're going to install this program. I'm going to have this be my default for the moment. So we'll install my security log parser. And so when I'm working in the API directory, I'm working on the back end of my application here. So when we're working with back end code, and it's not going to like that. It's going to convert is declared, but the value is never read. Yes, it's not going to like a require statement. So this is a awful aspect of what's going on with the web right now when it comes to Node.js. So you see their example is in require. That is the way Node.js used to work. And it still does in a lot of instances to pull that in and have the contents live in that file. More common now is for people to actually start following the web convention or ES6 style syntax of being able to import a file in this manner. Similar to what we had with LitElement, as you can see, it's actually suggesting that I do LitElement there. So to start off with this, let's do this. We'll just copy this XML that they have. All right, and so we've got this generic XML object that we're going to try to make work. And they say you can run convert XML to JSON, right? And there's compact or non-compact. Now, if I look at their API for what those mean, compact is a lot less. It's still the same information, but it's in a format that I should be able to work with a little more rapidly. Non-compact is like, this is a lot more of what an XML parser traditionally would give you. It's really verbose. Here's all the elements. Here's all the attributes on those elements. So let's just go with compact. So compact is going to be true. Result 1, and let's console log it so that we see what that does. But then I'm also going to do response.json. We're going to return what that JSON is. So I need to pull in something. I need to import as convert from. It might tell me that it can't do this, but we'll see. You get some syntax differences here that are a little annoying. In the short term, I might have to go and cheat and look up an example for how I pull that in. But this is the basic idea, that I have some front-end code that is now going to fetch against API as opposed to having the functionality live in the front end directly. So these calls to go and parse a string, I'm going to hollow out the XML. Let's say parse string. We're going to do parse from string. No, we're not going to do these things. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to do a fetch. We're going to fetch against API / XML to JSON. But it's not .js, it's just XML.json. So we're going to do a fetch against that. dot then response, and we're going to return the response as .json and .then data is a very common way of getting this, right? And I am just going to output it. Oh, we're going to start to work with fetch a lot more because we're getting data from somewhere. Hey, go fetch this for me. So I could do an async await, grab this data. I'm not going to do that at the moment. So we're going to try to step through this whole process here. So all I'm going to try to do at first is fetch against this location and get my data back. Save these, and now I have to do two things. I have to do npm start, and that spins up my front end. But for Vercel to work, and I'm going to show this not working, right? I click this, it says, hey, unexpected syntax. And if we look in the network, XML to JSON, it appears to call the right location, but there's nothing there. And that's because we have to actually run two servers simultaneously. Now, this is annoying. That's just kind of the way it is. One server is running the front end code, what you see here. The other server, which I will open another window, is running Vercel. So Vercel, set up and develop. Yes, we do want to set up and develop this. Which scope? BTO Pro, you won't get that question, hopefully. I found a project, link it, yes. Oh, so immediately have an issue here. Let's see, could not find module ES build. All right, so you have to have a valid buildable project to start with. So let's fix this, which I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not really sure why some people ran into this issue and others didn't. It has something to do with the options that you're selecting when you're initially building your project in the OpenWC UI. So I'm just pulling directly from this project here. Okay, so it says now there's a server available at localhost 3000. So I am going to go to here, and initially we're just going to brute force point this to the right place. All right, so I'm going to make my request against localhost 3000. Now that port is important. There's two different servers running here. As weird as that is. So it thought quite a bit more, right? But there's an error, and you can see there's a syntax error in my code, but this actually attempted to request and have a response returned from our microservice, right? So think of this other thing that I spun up as the backend. Vercel is your backend, your server that is actively running and can process requests, not just serve you static files. So failed to complete request to API, blah, 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 blah. So I need to probably cheat a little bit. So I copied this from the example subset that we will be playing with. Let me see if I have the syntax. It's not planet scale. Nope. Hello. Nope. That won't have any dependencies. Weather. Just gonna be import fetch. The issue has to do with knowing what is exported from here. Import default as. I'm sure that's what it is. All right, so you get to watch me struggle on this a little bit. I'm going to go to my mono repo where I have a bajillion endpoints and find something that imports this way. Now, this has to do with when certain packages were produced, unfortunately. Website, link validator. Nope. DuckDuckGo. Nope. Cache address. Nope. Got a lot of different endpoints there. Content browser. Nope. Insights. Nope. docx might be a good one. There we go. Need some weird syntax like this, and I don't love that this is the case, but older libraries do not properly package and export their material. So let's see if this actually works. Okay. Now, when you save backend code, you're not going to see it, but Vercel is actually going to process these requests, so you don't have to do any like compiling or anything. So, all right, let's hit parse again. And network. Fetch XHR. I got a 500 error on the back end. All right, so if you see a 500 error, that implies there's something wrong in your back end code here. All right, so this is cannot read property XML to JSON of undefined. All right, so now we get into doing some debug on the back end of this. So I can do console.log. It's getting close to running, right? It at least parsed my code. And let's see if there's anything on either of these objects. So now I can make the backend be invoked by just clicking this button. So the first thing is undefined, but the second thing actually has our method on it. So I'm going to go with that. Okay. So we've got df from there, and it would appear that df actually has this thing on it. So I should be able to do const convert equals df. Now I think that'll have the correct data type on it. Parse. There we go. So what the issue at play there is, and again, I keep harping on this, you have to be aware that JavaScript has changed over time. And so people write it differently each, series of years. Most of the time, that's not a big deal. But occasionally you get into these really big, breaking change cliff scenarios. One of them being that the world used to do things like this. Const convert equals require, right? That was what the example was. If you see require, that is not valid front-end JavaScript. You can use parsers to be able to read require statements and stitch everything together, but it's not the native way of doing it. So get rid of that. I have this working now. So there is some, there are conventions by which you can surface that, obviously, as I just struggled through this. So what's happening right now is now when I click the button on the front end, we're getting an error for some reason. However, we are getting an OK message. So we're not getting a server error, but we're not getting our response that we wanted. All right, so I think it might be because I actually want it as JSON, but let's clean this function up a little bit to see what's going on here. We're doing shorthand. So do if response.ok. What we do is we return response.json. Now, this was claiming that it did something. So let's do console.log response. Move that over there. CORS error. No access control header. Got it. Okay, so that's obnoxious, but I believe deleted the code that solves this. Yes, so I had these headers on here. These headers have to do with caching. So imagine when we're working in the API directory, we're working with a back-end server. So we'll talk about CORS a little bit in class. I ran into it here in case you see this error message. But it has to do with this, access control allow origin. So what this is an approach it's a security setting that the backend can say, I will return this response to you, but only if you're on an identical domain to me. Identical, down to that port number. So localhost colon 3000 is not the same as localhost colon 8000. Why would people doing server tech do this? So you have twitter.com. You are hosting the JavaScript assets, the JSON responses, all the stuff that actually powers that web service, right? When you go to it. You set up a competing service called like twittersucks.com, and you connect to the endpoints and try to just run their JavaScript code and their HTML and things on your server directly. Now, you can run their HTML, you just, go view source, copy and paste. You can run their CSS, copy and paste. But to actually get their data feeds, this CORS setting is going to block you at the server transport layer. You can still make the request, but it's not going to actually send the data back in a usable format. You're also going to have to have posted up JSON web tokens and security keys. It's for blocking things like that, right? So I can't just hijack your service by being a different system. So looking at some of these headers, and a lot of this is going to be a bit of copy and paste so that we get some of this out of the way. Cache control, right? So this has to do with caching the response. Vercel is incredible at high scale, low resource usage so that you can hit an infinite amount of users using this endpoint and still respond. The reason for that is if I get data that is a GET request, like a static address, I can cache that and send you back this instead. I'll try to draw what's going on when we get to this in class. There's also reducing the amount of methods, right? So you could say, hey, you can get this data, but it has to be posted in order to obtain this data, things like that, right? So, and these are some additional security header settings just so that we can play with this thing. So now, right, I see, hey, this has been blocked by CORS, right? So that is a common potential error. And now when I actually make my request, let's see what happens. Oh, perhaps nothing because I'm clicking on the wrong app. All right. Hey, now I can preview the data that came back. All right, and now if we go to console, we see this. So it doesn't actually appear to be in JSON. It appears to be a JSON blob. Right, now if we look on the server, right, it's kicking this out and this is JSON. So the difference being that this is just a string. Right, so data types start to become important. So Node.js convert JSON, convert string to JSON. Right, and I thought that's what it was. All right, so I can parse JSON from a string and convert it into an actual object. So let's do that. Because the end user could do this, like you being the person using this endpoint, you could actually do this on your side, but that's useful. So another aspect of JavaScript here, right? I can chain these things together. Oops, I have two cursors. There we go. Line, save. All right. Now let's see the difference. Okay, parse. So you see the difference here. That was a string, right? It's just written, printed here. It's not an actual data object. But I converted it to a data object on the back end and then sent it forward and told the front end, hey, parse this as JSON. So now I've been able to take this XML and parse it and give it back to you. Now, the next part is I don't want this XML. I want to send it XML. So we need to be able to post data or get data. I'm going to do post in this case. But so we can expand our fetch. And we can expand our fetch to do some values being sent across as well. So I can set the method, it will be post, and then I can set the body of the request. And we're going to say, thank you, Copilot. Okay. I'm going to do method post body. And so this is saying, instead of a get request, which is, hey, just go get that URL, post is take data and send it at that location. Now I can't cache this because I'm doing a post, which that part kind of sucks. The alternative would be to do like get XML and then actually encode the string in there, and that's not really good practice by any means. So I'm going to send the data that is just generated here on the fly, and we're going to post it up to that location. So save, and I'm probably going to have to cheat a little bit here again because I've written code that does that obtains what posts are very easily. It's under utilities here and request helpers. Okay. Utilities, request helpers. Yes, standard post body. So when you get the body, you have to actually parse it as JSON. And I'm going to put this in a try block here for fun. So, all right, in my XML to JSON, this is just JavaScript running. Now it's Node, but I can just write functions to do different things. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to start to use this request. Now, the first parameter coming in is the request. So that's the data that's been thrown at this endpoint, which is handled entirely by this function. The response is what I send back to you on the front end. So I've got this little standard post body thing. And all this is going to do is it's going to do that JSON parse again from before, right? Except it's going to do the JSON parse and then fail out if there's an issue and gracefully fail out. So that's what a try catch block is in JavaScript. It's going to try to return this JSON. If that fails, it's going to return null. And then I'll have to determine there was a problem, but it's not going to brick the script entirely. So I'm going to then do XML let XML equals standard post body. No, I don't want that XML. Okay. Yes, I did. Copilot did that again. Okay. So now I'm going to take out the XML body here. Now I might actually need this line. Let's see. In order to parse successfully. All right. So let's rename my variables here. We'll do result instead of result1. The catch header is not going to do anything anymore, but that's fine. All right. So what we're doing here is the request comes in. I'm going to parse the body, and then I'm going to return the XML parameter. Now I'm just going to do return nothing, so that way nothing.xml would be still valid. Be like, hey, that's null. So save that. Okay. Our little app again. Let's see the difference in the network. So I've got fetch xhr here, and I hit parse. And we've got an error, but you can see this is now done a post. And it's attempted to post this payload, which is claiming it's just an object, to the server. So let's see what we got on the back end is claiming. Cannot read property length of undefined. Okay. So now let's do console. Let's do this. Let's do body, right? Because it's the body of the request, and then we'll do let XML equal body.xml, so we can see if the data is actually coming across. Okay. No. Body and then XML. All right. Now let's see. Hit that, and it appears to just be hanging up or hanging up early. And oh, right there, right there. Nothing and undefined. Okay. So it's not actually getting that posted up. So let's see what request body is. We're not getting XML. And we're getting object. So that is going to imply, and I could see that before, right? The payload says object. It's going to imply that there is a problem in initial encoding. All right, so this is a front-end application issue. And the reason for that is, I'm not entirely sure right there. It should be able to send an object there as far as I'm concerned. Perhaps I need to do JSON.stringify. See if that's appropriate. So, hey, there we go. Now we're actually sending this up. So yes, I had to actually stringify the body. The body is a string. And what JSON.stringify does is it's a built-in helper on the front end and back end that says, take this object and turn it into a string. So once it's turned into a string, I can send it to the server. And then the server can walk through this, and we actually appear to have, we successfully went end to end right there. Yes, it actually was able to do the parsing to get that data back out. So that's awesome. All right, so now I can send requests that are a valid XML format and get a valid response back. So we hit parse, it parses from that endpoint. Now let's take out some of our debug code on the front end. Now that we have the response, we verified it's okay, and then we get this back. Right, so now I'm just going to do alert data. All right, so we can see it instead of having a console log every time. And it's an object because it's not in string format. So I'm not going to just alert it there. What we're going to do instead is, I see there's your XML query here. I'm going to make a text area. Right, so a text area tag. If I save, you'll see, right, there's just this blob here. Now, text areas, I can say some silly attributes. We use perfectly honest calls, like 50 rows, 50, 40, whatever, right? So you get this nice big response here, sure. Okay, then I am going to do this.shadowroot.query selector. Wow, I already knew what I was going to do. Okay, query selector dot value equals data. Now, if I do this, it shouldn't work because it's an object, and this prints strings. So I can do my JSON.stringify or data, and I believe if you do null and then 2, and this is a little UI in a second, but if you stringify with these additional parameters, it's going to like pretty print it. There we go. Now, if I don't do that, if I just do data, you'll see. Let's look at the difference here. It just, yep, I stringed it. This takes it and puts in 2 spaces for each indentation of the thing. So it's much more readable in this case. So the other part to this would be handling a file, right? So a file is not going to be posted up. We can see there's a file in a source here locally. So I could either read in the file and then send the contents of the file to my endpoint, or I could make my endpoint able to accept files, which it then goes and fetches. That becomes stylistic as far as the way you want to structure your endpoint. Do you want to allow file submission as well as the actual thing and resolve between the two? Or is this just dedicated to taking XML and giving JSON back? And I don't have a great answer to this. I would say probably if you ask most people in industry, they would tell you its dedicated purpose is XML as a string and it returns JSON. If it's to process files, that's a different endpoint. You could make it do both. And I don't have a real preference personally as to when I do both, one or the other. But so let's convert this method to use this employee file, whatever this is, okay? So the way we're going to do that is I am going to just directly load the file, and we'll see if I can get it that way, right? So if we remember from the image loading aspect, right, I could do const, and we are going to do XML file equals new URL. And the new URL is going to be that.ref. And we'll console.log XML file, just to be sure, in case there's an error there. Then I basically just got my fetch, but I'm going to fetch that address there. So I'm going to chain these together. I'm not going to do it a single wait. I could do it that way. So it goes thing, 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 thing. Instead, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to request that XML file. Right. Then once I get it, the response, I'm going to return. And if you don't write the word return, you just have the thing. It is assumed that is returned so that we are aware of the syntax here. So I'm going to do .text. Knew that I was parsing XML. This is pretty brilliant. Okay, so then I should get back the data, and the data of that file is just XML, whatever the response is. So if data, we got something, right? Then what I want to do is I want to fetch, similar to this methodology here, right? Now, instead of parsing this random string, I can refactor this, right? So we can say, we've got parse XML string, and we'll do a go get XML, right? And this is going to take in XML, run through this stuff, and it's just going to this be and await. Whoop, no, we'll do it that way. Yeah, you do async and then return, await, fetch. And that would give me the data at the end. Or we're not. We're just going to write to the text area for the time being. So I'm requesting this endpoint with whatever XML just came in, the variable name. So now I can do this dot go get XML, right? And so that other thing works. But now I've got this wrapped, so I don't have to just go and copy and paste that function again. If you're copying and pasting an entire function over and over again, it's probably wrong. The general rule. Maybe not wrong so much as necessary. Okay, now let's name this something else because that's not what it is anymore. So XML from file, and I probably would make this, that doesn't make it a private function, but it's just a convention people use. But I'm going to name it since it's not that anymore, right? Microservice. All right. Save. Okay, so let's look at the XHRs on this. Do this one. It just goes up, comes back. Sweet. Do this one, though. And now we've got the data that's in that file back as JSON, right? The first request goes and it gets the XML file, then it turns it into text, and then it throws that text at our microservice. So that's a more probable scenario as far as how I would interface with that. I could also have like an upload field, and I click the file selector and it gets the XML file. And I could either parse it on the front end if I have the right APIs in my browser, or I might just go, hey, there's this file, and throw it at the endpoint, and the endpoint figures it out. In a traditional monolithic server environment, where let's say I've got all this PHP running on the back end, or I could be Node and it's just actually just running at all times. The server's always on. I'm probably not going to send a random file and try to unpack it and figure out what it is, because my whole server's running, and that's a possible, area for exploit. However, in microservice architecture, the thing that's going to run that code is a little container that spins up and is dead 30 seconds later. I don't really care. If I throw a zip file at that and I unpack it and it's some horrific virus that kills the container, it literally didn't affect anyone else using the app the correct way. And this is, from a security attack vector perspective, another reason why people are starting to move to this approach. So let's see. I need one more thing to make this work out in actual Vercel. And it's I have to get this address to be sufficiently abstract. Now, localhost 3000 does not exist when it's published. The point of this whole thing with Vercel is I'm testing locally. I know now that this works and will build successfully, but I need it to go out and be out there, not here. So this little security log parser app should work, but I need to figure out how to make the request correctly. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because I forget what my call is. So I actually made something called micro front end registry. Yes. And so the micro front end registry is an element that I made that's a singleton element. And the singleton's entire purpose is to just make sure that it successfully makes these calls so that we simplify our logic for getting them and has some debug fallback support for things. I believe in this. The way that I then define services, just so we see this abstraction, would be like this. So whenever I want to call something, I actually just have a line similar to that abstraction before where I said, go get the XML. I have a class that's there that I can pull into my code, and then I can say microfrontend registry.call, and I can reference a more human readable name like, hey, go validate this link, and send it parameters, and it figures out how to make the request, and it'll come back as JSON. So what I need to find is I'm going to go to my monorepo stuff, and there is like Vercel. There are global variables. Micro front end registry is going to hit this base. Localhost endpoint starts with API. See, I'm just hitting my actual endpoint directly. Now, this is okay. This is another possible way of solving this. Is I calculate what the base is. Yeah, we're going to go with that. So you can see if the origin starts with a localhost address, when I'm doing my calls, I'm not writing localhost. I am actually just doing /API. But in order to broker the difference between this 8,000 port and the 3,000 port that'll spin up with Vercel, I do this little replacement here. So I'm going to basically copy this function, and then that way it'll be in our example so we can see the future. And so I'm going to do Vercel base a variable. Do this dot Vercel base. And then internal to my element, and this doesn't have to be in the properties definition, do Vercel base. It's thinking name. That's so weird. Still getting used to this. So Vercel base, we'll just make nothing to start. But then, if our Windows origin, so this is going to spin up and this app will run, and well, if the origin has localhost in it, we're going to do this replacement. So let's see if that's enough to make it work. Got my security log, inspect, make sure we don't get any console logs. So that parser still worked. Nice. So then this one should work too. Good. And so if we look at the network, that is going to go out the door to localhost 3000, even though it's actually supposed to just be / whatever. So the default will be nothing. And then if it's nothing, right, because when we're in production, we're not going to have this consideration. And I believe there's some other ways using environmental variables to get around this, but this is the way that's made the most sense to me personally. All right, so I've got an endpoint. It works locally. I've got my front end code, right? I've got my 2 servers running so that I could test this whole process. And I've got my little test thing. So now I just got to push the code up, and security log parser will rebuild. So the way I'm going to do that is I will close this window out, and we'll stop the server. All right, I'll look at that. I don't need all these servers running. Okay, I'll close that window. All right, we've got security log parser, get status, get add a, get commit m, Vercel API endpoint test. All right, get push origin name. Right, so that is now pushed up to GitHub, and we can see that this has just picked up the build. Now, fun thing with Vercel, I can hit this and I can expand build, and you can actually watch it build. to figure out if you have errors in your app. Now, you don't have to do any special configuration to make that /API thing work. This is just built into the way that all Vercel endpoints are able to work. Roll up plugin, import meta assets, no such file or directory, src employee.xml. Ugh. All right. So that's pretty cryptic, right? Yeah. And I know what it is because I've unfortunately run into these sorts of errors before. Now, we've talked before about bundling and parsers and Webpack and this kind of magic that takes our assets in a certain format and then they work when they're built. Rollup is another more popular, more modern version of Webpack, if you will. It's able to roll your assets up into one package that's very small to ship them. For that to work, though, it has to know where everything is in your little application. Now, I should be able to test this locally. Now, if I do npm run build, this should fail. Yes. And it has the same error. So go back into code and try to solve this directly. So its issue is this call here, right? The /src employee XML. Now, it's probably because it should be relative to where I am right now. I'm actually in the src directory. I believe I could put it in assets and it would just work from there natively, but let's see. So this should be like this, a /employee. And let's see if that fixes it. I'm not positive. Yep. Okay. Now, the reason it was complaining about that is, and if we go into the actual dist, like what is the built thing, you can see the XML file is here and it's renamed it something else, right? So part of what rollup and these bundlers are going to do is they're going to smash your files together into ways that are unrecognizable. And it's so that when they're shipped to the end user, they are as small as is possible, right? So this XML file still has spaces, and I'm actually surprised it didn't minify that. But our partial, if you will, it has the licenses in it. Technically, you're supposed to send the licenses not minified, but there are options to remove them. But I mean, look at our code. This is our code that we wrote, right? And you can see text areas in there in that LitElement class, but it's completely unrecognizable. So this is what this is doing, is it's shipping the minimum amount of code, and it's targeting a specific ES version. So even if you wrote it all for modern JavaScript, based on rollup's configuration here, which we can see in rollup.config.js, it's actually going to target something else. And you can see there's ES build here. This is what ES build does. It's going to take your assets and build them to a target. And we can see here the target is make sure this stuff works on Chrome 64, Firefox 67, and Safari 11.1. And so the brilliance of these minifiers, even though it does make things more complex, is you can ship faster code without thinking about any of that stuff in between, right? So if you don't want to minify your CSS, you turn that off. And then your CSS is still readable. You can also have strict rules associated with your CSS. In this case, fail on error, which is what it just did before, right? Saying, hey, if I go to build and there's something that isn't there, hard stop. It could have just been like, yep, that file doesn't exist and keep going, but it didn't. So we're not going to get into a ton of the configuration of said file. When we actually do our project, I will give you a file that hopefully has all of these types of a layer of issues resolved. But this should be somewhat readable, right? And this is why people have aligned with JavaScript for all these different purposes. Rollup is a Node plugin, Node.js, right? You can see these imports. These are in ES6 syntax. And so I should be able to read and debug this and then write the front end of my application, right? And so this pattern is emerging of these two sides of this. This is tooling level, right? So this is CLI. I run this in the command line, and I've written the same way for that as I did for my backend code, as I did for my front end code. So this is why the industry is aligning this way. Now I'm going to go push this up and see if it works this time. I see. I have to remove my dist folder entirely from version control. status, get add a, get commit m, parser fix path, and get push origin main. Now, if I do npm run build, we should not see things in version control. Seriously. Okay, different file. That's fine. Custom elements.json is allowed to be modified. It's a manifest. I'm going to show you. It's a manifest that is for other parsers to understand the topology of what you've written. And so it says, here's the path to this. It's a JavaScript module. It has this name for the class, right? So this is a way that other parsers, and actually this type of information is what's being fed into tool sets like Copilot, so that it's doing those autocompletes. Not exactly that format, but things like that. Stuff that analyzes your code. 50 seconds ago, it says ready, but seriously, is it actually ready? Wow, that built really fast. All right, I just got an email. Visit. Boom. And so what we now have is a fully functional end-to-end micro front end. The front end being this side, invoking a back end to go and execute our request, right? And it's actually hitting this, kind of semi-fictional address here, right? Because it just made that up. The other thing with Vercel, it did that automatically. This is specific to this build. So what you can start to do pipeline-wise is say, did that commit, or even better, these open on pull request. So you can issue a pull request. It'll go and do the thing and then give you the address to say, here's what this pull request will look like. So you know what the code is about to do when it's actually built. And large teams can assemble files across their ecosystems under this approach. Right? Vercel is a game changer. It's not the only one. There's Next.js, which I forget where. Next.js hosting. I always forget the name of it. Oh, Vercel, sorry. Netlify, that's the other one. Netlify is another very popular vendor of this type for microservice deployment architecture. So I use this personally. If you've used our course websites and you hit the PDF button, you've used this without realizing it. So I have endpoints that do all kind of stuff. Take screenshots of things, convert things to PDF, now apparently take XML and convert it to JSON. I'll be adding that one. Take Markdown and convert it to HTML. Take HTML and convert it to a doc file. Convert a doc file into Markdown. You can go from any format to any format very easily. I've also been able to start using this to go and request addresses, see if they're valid, return whether or not they're valid. Request address, parse the file that comes across as HTML, and then convert it into this other format. Really sophisticated one-offs is the important thing, right? I'm not pervasively storing that stuff that I just mentioned as a file. You might be using our text editor. You might have your content already in an XML or a Word doc file. I don't need you to copy and paste that stuff. When you could send me the file, this endpoint spins up temporarily, processes the file, sends back HTML, puts it in the page. So we can see that I also have the main address, right, as opposed to that one. And so this one might actually say, sometimes what you get into with this is Vercel is caching so heavily, you might need to actually right click and inspect. And a few people actually experienced this locally with their own demos before. But you inspect, have this open, and you either go to the network tab and check disable cache, which I always do, or you do Control-Shift-R. And Control-Shift-R is like a super refresh that ignores your local system's version of assets and defers to what's coming from the server. The reason for this being important is especially sometimes Chrome will be like, no, I already know what you want. And it'll show you an older, outdated version of what it is when you're iterating rapidly over this stuff. So this is the notion of where we're going with Project 2 here. We're going beyond just the front end component. We're going to actually start to take a working comp, something that's out there that isn't written this way. We're going to design the front end assets, and then we're going to design the back end that can be searched and load these responses. So it's not going to be exactly this XML thing. This was just to show an example of how to do this, because I want you to go through the process of how we would build things like this. Project 3 is going to be somewhere between Project 1 and Project 2 as far as what it is. It's either going to be highly designed, lots of elements, or it's going to be creating microservices that then remote render things or have everything be compartmentalized into the front end.